In this video, we'll be talking about the origins of bluegrass and how it has evolved into what it is today. Bluegrass was developed in the Appalachian region of the United States. The music drew its characteristics from old-time and traditional European folk music. The settlers of the Appalachian region were primarily English and Scottish, and they brought the musical traditions from their homelands to their new home. This is why jigs and reels, especially with the fiddle, were what defined the developing style. In addition, enslaved people from West Africa are responsible for introducing the banjo to the Americas, which is one of the defining instruments of the genre. The developing stages of bluegrass were influenced and often based on the child ballads that originated from England, Ireland, and Scotland. Most of these ballads consisted of a particular narrative accompanied by a dance and fiddle, and were occasionally paired with other string instruments. Some examples include Pretty Sorrow, which originated in England.
I looked all around me, and none could I see that were sweeter or fairer, pretty Sorrow, than thee.
Cuckoo Bird, also originating from England.
Well, I've played cards in old England, and I've gambled over in Spain, and I'll bet you $10.
Leather Breeches, which originates from Scotland. And Soldier's Joy, also originating from Scotland.
So see laid down, you come down the hill and turn, hurry up, boy, and don't be bored, you ain't gonna wear that shoe no more.
Both the fiddle and the guitar are believed to have been incorporated in the earliest traces of bluegrass. The first European settlers of the Appalachian are known to have brought both fiddles and guitars to the region. The fiddle was especially important since most of the ballads included it. The guitar was often included too, but historians mostly agree that the instrument was often deemed less important than the fiddle. The fiddle and the guitar's role in bluegrass has evolved over time, with the instruments taking on a vast diversity of roles in the modern era of bluegrass. In modern times, the bass is considered a crucial instrument in bluegrass ensembles. However, in the Origins era of bluegrass, evidence points to the usage of the cello, not the bass. However, the cello dropped out of sight in the Origins bluegrass and became associated with the orchestra, and was no longer used. The double bass was very common in the 20th century, and was essential in the formation of the genre. And the cello, on the other hand, was not reintroduced to bluegrass until the 1990s. When thinking of bluegrass instruments, the banjo almost always comes to one's mind. In my opinion, the banjo is the bluegrass instrument that has the most riveting history. The banjo was almost certainly brought to the New World by slaves, and as early as 1781, Thomas Jefferson, writing about slaves on his own plantation, said, "The instrument proper to them is the banjar, which they have brought hither from Africa." Many of these early banjars were made from the gourds and played with a fretless neck. We have no idea how these sounded, but surviving illustrations suggest they use heavy strings and probably had a deep, mellow sound. While the introduction of banjos to the white Appalachian musicians from African Americans likely occurred much earlier, by 1847 we have the first eyewitness accounts of the fiddle and banjo being played together in the South. This moment is what many consider to be the true origin of the modern bluegrass band. The original banjar-style banjos were eventually dropped in favor of the five-stringed banjo. As noted by historians, Earl Scruggs made the five-stringed banjo especially significant for the genre. The mandolin is one of the most common instruments used in bluegrass in the modern era. However, there are little traces of mandolin use in the Origins bluegrass era. The mandolin only became popular in the 20th century. In the early part of the 20th century, large numbers of mandolins were sold, particularly by the Gibson Guitar Company, which manufactured and promoted a new type of flat-backed mandolin. The majority of the instruments sold were used in mandolin orchestras. These eventually went out of style by the 1920s. However, around the same time as the mandolin's loss in popularity, the instrument began to be used in the performance of traditional mountain folk music throughout the Appalachian Mountains. By the 1930s, a Kentucky fiddle and mandolin player named Bill Monroe helped create the genre of bluegrass. While bluegrass had not officially been named yet, the combination of Irish and Scottish fiddle tunes with the American banjo had already been in the works, and Monroe was the first musician to officially and famously bring all of these elements together and incorporate the mandolin. Hence, he was known as the father of bluegrass. The resonator guitar, also known as the dobro, is another instrument commonly seen in contemporary bluegrass. The dobro was introduced to the genre by Josh Graves, who played with flattened Scruggs in the mid-1950s. The instrument was uncommon until musicians like Jerry Douglas and Mike Aldridge began to popularize it later on. The exact origin of the word bluegrass is unknown. The word bluegrass is also the common name of a grass species found in Kentucky, where Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys band originate from. Hence, many attribute the origin of the word to the title of Bill Monroe's band. Ralph Stanley, a bluegrass musician who lived around the same time as Bill Monroe, pointed out, "Oh, Monroe was the first, but it wasn't called bluegrass back then. It was just called old-time hillbilly music. When they started doing the bluegrass festivals in 1965, everyone got together and wanted to know what to call the show, you know? It was decided that since Bill was the oldest man and was from the bluegrass state of Kentucky and he had the Bluegrass Boys, it would be called bluegrass." Since Bill Monroe helped to classify the genre, fans and musicians of the genre have colloquially classified 3 or 4 generations since then. What's known as the first generation of bluegrass occurred from the mid-1940s to the 1950s and consisted of the first people who officially classified the genre. This era was known as the Golden Age of Bluegrass. Some examples include Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys.
I hear a voice calling. It must be it must be our Lord. It's coming from heaven on high.
Another example is Earl Scruggs. The second generation of bluegrass was from the mid to late 1960s to the mid-1980s. Many of the artists had played in first-generation bands from a young age, yet there is a noticeable shift in the genre. Sam Bush is a great example of this shift. His music differed from traditional bluegrass because he started to incorporate strong jazz elements in his works. Another example is Jerry Douglas. Jerry Douglas is very famous for his use of the dobro. Many other bluegrass bands started to incorporate it after him. And Del McCoury is also a very famous musician from the second generation.
Yeah, I was just 13 and myself was a musical proverbial knee-high. When I heard a couple new sounding tunes on the tube and they blasted me sky high. Then the record man said everyone is yelling some record from Nashville.
The third generation of bluegrass occurred from the mid-1980s to the 2000s. Higher quality sound equipment changed the genre, with each musician mic'd independently. The electric bass became a common alternative to traditional acoustic bass, though electrification of other instruments continued to meet resistance outside progressive circles. The Tony Rice is a good example of a third-generation band that pioneered the use of the electric bass within the genre.
Well, I cut the blues, I was longing for some company. It's many miles from where I am to the only one for me.
The third generation also saw a renaissance of traditional songs played in the newer style. The Johnson Boys were an example of this, playing strictly traditional bluegrass. And now, in present times, we are in the fourth generation. There is a large assortment of styles within this current time period, from strictly traditional to involving classical elements and/or increased electrification. The Punch Brothers is a good example of a band that incorporates classical elements. Most of the musicians in the group are former classical musicians that decided to use their knowledge to make great sounding bluegrass. Their music has shifted from what's commonly seen as hillbilly to a more sophisticated sound.
Sing it out when we go on. We'll have it all.
Tejon Street Corner Thieves is a modern bluegrass band that incorporates all of the acoustic string instruments that you'd usually find in a bluegrass band, yet it also includes the drums, and most of the songs revolve around alcoholism and the lead singer's struggles with it.
I have changed my sound, and I got a drinking problem. I need to settle down. Well, maybe they're right now. Maybe I am wrong, but this here drinking problem is written one damn song.
Marty O'Reilly is a good example of how bluegrass has started to incorporate more indie-sounding vocals, while retaining the integrity of strictly traditional bluegrass acoustic string instruments.
And you see me tearing up my floorboards, white sheets covered youth, fire in my eyes, and water pouring through the roof. And you heard I found a mine shaft digging past midnight, crawled into the dark with the cold canary gaslight.
In addition, the modern era has seen a surge of popularity with female artists. One famous example is Molly Tuttle.
The sun up above shines its fury on the prairie. You can hide from it, you can try it, but you'll never get away. And they sow the fields, but the clouds have all forsaken. They've taken all.
To conclude, the story of bluegrass has a deep history. It all started out with the first immigrants and slaves in America who brought their musical traditions from home to the Appalachia. Even though bluegrass was only recognized officially in the 20th century, the music has roots that can be traced back several centuries. Since its recognition in the 1940s, the genre has diversified at an incredible rate with countless subgenres, with much more to come. I'm sure the earliest Appalachian folk bands would be quite proud at what their genre has developed into, and the bright future it still has.